I need to tell you something. I need to say it out loud because I've been carrying it inside my chest for weeks now and it's eating me alive. My name is Alara Whitfield. I'm 29 years old. And 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday night, I found out that everything I believed about my father, about his shame, about his failure, about why we lost our house and why he couldn't look at me anymore, was a lie. I should back up. My dad, Thomas Whitfield, was a lawyer. A good one. He joined Callaway, Mercer & Holt in the early 90s, back when he was just a kid from nowhere who'd gotten through law school on scholarships and stubbornness. By 1997, he was working the Greendale chemical spill case, a huge environmental litigation, the kind that makes careers. I was 11. We lived on Larkspur Lane in a house with a blue door and a yard where he'd push me on a tire swing after dinner. Then they said he fabricated evidence. They said he planted documents to manipulate the case. He was disbarred. We lost the house. We moved to a 2-bedroom apartment on 22 Wren Street in Millbrook, and my mom, Grace, started working double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. My dad sat in a chair by the window for years. He stopped talking much. He died of a heart attack when I was 19. He was 47. I became a lawyer because of him. I joined Callaway, Mercer & Holt because of him, because I wanted to prove that a Whitfield could walk those halls and belong there. I spent 6 years at 714 Piedmont Road, working nights, skipping weekends, building something I thought would honor him. That Tuesday, I was in the archive basement pulling precedent files for a new environmental case, Standard Research, and I found a sealed box on a back shelf labeled GCS 1997, internal only. I opened it. Inside were memorandums between Roland Callaway, the firm's founding partner, now dead, and Victor Mercer, the current managing partner. And in those memos, in plain language, on firm letterhead, they discussed how they would plant fabricated evidence in the Greendale chemical spill case and pin it on my father, to protect their client, Greendale Chemical Corp., to shield them from $200 million in liability. My dad didn't do it. He never did any of it. The firm I gave my life to, the firm I walked into every morning and felt proud of, they destroyed him. On purpose. They picked him because he was easy to sacrifice, and they let him take the fall. And they watched him lose everything, and they never said a word. I don't remember how long I knelt there on that concrete floor. I remember my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to photograph the pages. I remember the sound of my own breathing, too fast, echoing off the filing cabinets. I remember my face just crumbling, not crying the way you see in movies, just my whole face falling apart and the tears coming and not being able to stop them. I photographed every page, every single one. Then I put the documents back in the box and sealed it and slid it onto the shelf exactly where I found it. I drove home to my apartment at 15 Sycamore Court. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on my kitchen floor in the dark and I shook for hours. My dad was innocent, and I'd been working for the people who killed him. I called in sick the next morning. First time in 6 years. I didn't get out of bed until almost noon, and when I did, I drove straight to Cedarwood Memorial Cemetery. I hadn't been there in a few months, which I felt guilty about, but I couldn't. I couldn't go without a reason, because every time I stood in front of his headstone, I'd start bargaining with God or the universe or whoever, asking to trade things for 5 more minutes with him. It never worked. It just left me hollowed out. But that day I sat in the grass next to his grave and I pressed my hand flat against the stone and I told him. I whispered it. Dad, I know. I found it. You didn't do it. I know you didn't do it. The stone was cold. Obviously. It's always cold. But I stayed there for over an hour, talking to him like he could hear me, telling him I was sorry. Sorry that I'd spent years carrying a small, secret, ugly doubt. This splinter in my mind that maybe, just maybe, he really had done it. I hated myself for that. I hated that they'd made me doubt him, even a little. On the drive back, I found myself on 22 Wren Street without really deciding to go there. I parked across from our old apartment building. It looked the same. Dirty brick, narrow windows, that busted intercom by the front door. I sat in my car and I could hear my mom's keys in the lock at 11 at night after a double shift. I could smell that hallway. Cleaning solution and someone's cooking and something damp underneath it all. I remembered lying in bed listening to her footsteps, knowing she'd check on me before she sat down, knowing she wouldn't sit down for long because she had to be back at the hospital by 6. My mom, Grace, she's 58 now. She lives in a little cottage at 7 Birchwood Lane, still in Millbrook. She retired from nursing a couple of years ago. Her knees are bad. She doesn't talk about my dad much anymore. She keeps his photo on the nightstand, but she turned it face down for a while after he died, and I don't know when she turned it back up. On day 3, I met Jonah Pratt at the Copper Kettle Cafe. Jonah's 31, an associate at the firm like me, and the closest thing I have to a best friend. I showed him the photos on my phone. His face went white. He said, "Ilara, Jesus." Then he said what I already knew. That if I went public, I'd be going to war with Victor Mercer, a 64-year-old man with 3 decades of connections, with the resources of the entire firm behind him, with friends on every bench in the state. That I'd lose my job. That the partnership vote was in 6 weeks and I was the frontrunner. That Mercer would come after me with everything. Jonah wasn't telling me to stay quiet. He was making sure I understood the cost. I understood. The cost was the same thing my dad paid. On day 4, I drove to 7 Birchwood Lane to see my mom. She opened the door and she looked so small. She'd made tea. She asked me if I was eating enough. I sat at her kitchen table and I almost told her. The words were right there, but I looked at her hands, the way they shook a little now when she poured, and I couldn't do it. Not yet. I hugged her at the door for too long. She patted my back and said, "You're working too hard, sweetheart." I made it to the car before I started crying again. I went back to work on day 5. I smiled at the receptionist. I made small talk in the elevator. I sat at my desk at 714 Piedmont Road and I opened my laptop and I started building a case against the people paying my salary. I'm a lawyer. That's not just what I do, it's how I think. Emotion wasn't going to bring anyone to justice. Evidence would. So every night after the office cleared out, I went back to the archives and I copied documents, memos, billing records, internal correspondence from the Greendale chemical spill case. I cross-referenced everything with the public trial records from 1997. I built a timeline. I built a chain of evidence. I was careful. I was methodical. I was terrified. By day 10, I'd found something else. A name, Margaret Huang. She was 62 now, a former Greendale chemical employee who had tried to blow the whistle on the contamination data back in 97. The public records showed she'd been listed as a potential witness and then suddenly withdrawn. No explanation in the file, but in one of the internal memos there was a note in Victor Mercer's handwriting. Huang handled. No further concern. I found her address. 33 Oak Ridge Drive, here in Ashford. On day 12, I drove there. It was a modest house, clean yard, wind chimes on the porch. A woman opened the door, small, gray-haired, reading glasses pushed up on her head. Margaret Huang. I told her I was a lawyer looking into the 1997 Greendale case. She started to close the door immediately. Her face just shut down. She said she had nothing to say. I said, "My name is Ilara Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield was my father." She stopped. She looked at me, really looked at me, and her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then she started to cry. Not loud, just tears falling down her face while she stood in the doorway, holding the edge of the door like it was the only thing keeping her up. She let me in. We sat at her kitchen table with a pot of tea between us, and she told me everything. How Mercer had come to her personally, how he'd threatened her career, her pension, implied things about her family, how she'd been so scared she'd packed a bag and almost left the state, how she'd watched my father's disbarment on the news and felt sick and done nothing, how she'd carried that for 18 years. They picked him because he had no one, she said. No connections, no family in the profession. He was a scholarship kid. He was easy. She said it like she'd been rehearsing it in her head for 2 decades, waiting for someone to finally ask. Margaret agreed to give me a sworn affidavit. Back at the firm, things were shifting. Victor Mercer started appearing near my office more often. Small comments. "Working late again, Ilara?" a hand on my shoulder that lasted a beat too long. On day 18, Jonah pulled me into the stairwell and told me Mercer's assistant had been seen near my workstation after hours. On day 21, I tried to badge into the archive basement and the light flashed red. Access revoked. No explanation. That night, I backed up every file to encrypted cloud storage. I printed a full physical copy and mailed it to a P.O. box I'd rented across town under a name that wasn't mine. They were watching me. I was running out of time. Day 22. I was sitting on my couch at 15 Sycamore Court, going through the digital copies one more time, organizing everything for the state bar filing. And in a batch of scanned documents I'd pulled from the archive on day 9, I found a file I'd initially skipped over, a single letter buried between billing summaries. It was from my father, addressed to Roland Calloway, dated 3 weeks before the fabricated evidence was discovered. In the letter, my dad wrote that he had reason to believe Greendale Chemical was hiding contamination data from the court. He cited specific irregularities in the testing reports. He said he intended to petition for an independent environmental audit. He was asking Calloway, his boss, the man he trusted, for support. He wasn't just innocent. He was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to protect people. And that exact thing is why they went after him. He got too close. He was going to expose the truth, so they made him the lie. I put my phone down, and I pressed my hands over my face, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the night I found the box, because I'd spent 10 years grieving a man I thought had been broken by bad luck. But it wasn't bad luck. He was brave. He saw something wrong, and he tried to fix it, and they crushed him for it, and he died thinking everyone believed the worst of him. And the contamination. I pulled the public health data that night. The Greendale neighborhood on the east side of Ashford. Elevated cancer rates for 20 years. Respiratory illness. Children getting sick. The chemical spill was never properly cleaned up because the case was sabotaged. My father's destruction wasn't just personal. A whole community was poisoned because the firm needed to protect a client's money. On day 23, Victor Mercer called me into his corner office at 714 Piedmont Road. He sat behind that enormous mahogany desk with the skyline behind him, and he smiled at me. He told me he'd noticed my exceptional dedication to research lately. He said the partners had discussed it and they wanted to offer me the partnership early, effective immediately, plus a $500,000 signing bonus. He never mentioned the box. He never mentioned the Greendale case. He just looked at me with those calm gray eyes and said, "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, Alara. Choose wisely." I sat there. I want to be honest about this. I sat there, and for about 5 seconds, I thought about taking it. $500,000, my name on the letterhead, everything I'd worked for since I was 19 years old, handed to me on a plate. And all I had to do was pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. 5 seconds, maybe 10. Then I saw my dad's handwriting in that letter, neat, careful, earnest, and I stood up. I looked Mercer in the eye. I didn't say a word. I walked out of his office and I kept walking until I was in the parking garage, and then I sat in my car and I gripped the steering wheel and I shook. That night I called my mom. I sat on my kitchen floor, the same spot I'd sat in the dark on day 1, and I told Grace Whitfield everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He always told me he didn't do it, Alara, every single day until he died. He told me and I believed him, but I couldn't prove it, and neither could he." She was crying. I was crying. Then she said, "Do what you need to do, baby. We already lost everything once. We survived it." On day 24, I filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Disciplinary Board. I submitted everything: the archived memos between Roland Calloway and Victor Mercer, Margaret Huang's sworn affidavit, my father's suppressed letter, and the environmental contamination data from the Greendale neighborhood. Every page, every photograph, every piece of the story they'd buried for 18 years. That same morning, I walked into the offices of the Ashford Tribune and sat down with an investigative journalist named Diane Castellano. I gave her a copy of the full file. I told her who I was. I told her what I'd found. I told her about my father. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she said she'd need a few days to verify independently before they could publish. I said I understood. I'd waited 18 years. I could wait 4 more days. I wasn't being strategic, or maybe I was, I don't know. I just knew that filing with the bar alone might not be enough. Mercer had friends everywhere. He could slow walk an investigation, call in favors, make things disappear. But he couldn't make a newspaper story disappear once it was out. On day 26, I got the call. Callaway, Mercer, and Holt was suspending me pending an internal review. They sent someone to collect my badge and my laptop. I packed my desk into a cardboard box. It took about 5 minutes, which tells you something about 6 years of your life. And I walked out of 714 Piedmont Road for the last time. Jonah was waiting in the lobby. He handed his own badge to the security guard and said, "I'm done too." He'd written his resignation letter that morning. I told him he didn't have to do this. He said, "Yeah, I know." We stood on the sidewalk outside the building and neither of us said anything for a minute. Then he said, "Copper kettle? I'm buying." And I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks, and it came out sounding strange, like I'd forgotten how. Victor Mercer hired a crisis management team. He released a public statement calling my allegations fabricated revenge by a disgruntled employee. I'd expected that. It was the obvious play. Discredit the source, make it personal, make it small. I read the statement on my phone and my hands were steady. He could say what he wanted. I had the documents. On day 28, the Ashford Tribune ran Diane Castellano's front-page story. The headline read, "Buried Truth. How a prestigious firm destroyed an innocent lawyer and poisoned a community." Margaret Huang gave a televised interview that afternoon. She sat in a studio chair and she looked into the camera and she said, "I was afraid for 18 years. I'm not afraid anymore." Residents of the Greendale neighborhood, people who'd been sick, people who'd lost family members, came forward with their stories. The piece went everywhere. National outlets picked it up by evening. By day 30, Victor Mercer was placed under emergency suspension from the practice of law. The state attorney general opened a criminal investigation into obstruction of justice and environmental fraud. The other partners at Callaway, Mercer and Holt, released a statement distancing themselves from Mercer so fast it would have been funny if any of this were funny. And my mom, Grace, sat in her cottage at 7 Birchwood Lane and watched the news coverage. Jonah called me that night and told me he'd checked on her. He said she was crying, but she was smiling while she did it. Thomas Whitfield's disbarment was officially placed under posthumous review. I sat on my couch at 15 Sycamore Court, and I stared at the ceiling, and I don't know what I felt, not victorious, not relieved exactly, exhausted, emptied, like something that had been clenched inside me for years was finally letting go, and it hurt to uncurl. 6 weeks later. Day 72. The State Bar formally overturned my father's disbarment. Posthumously, they restored his name, his record, his standing as a member of the bar. 18 years erased. Not the damage, you can't erase that, but the lie. The lie was finally gone. They held a small ceremony at the Ashford County Courthouse. It was a Tuesday, which felt right somehow, because it was on a Tuesday that I found that box, and it was on a Tuesday that my whole life cracked open. My mom was there. She wore the navy blue dress she saves for important things. Her hands shook when she sat down, but she held her chin up and she didn't look away from the podium once. Jonah stood next to me. Margaret Huang came, and she held my mom's hand during the reading of the formal order, and I watched these 2 women who'd never met before, one who'd loved Thomas Whitfield and one who'd been too afraid to save him, hold on to each other like they'd known one another forever. A few people from the Greendale neighborhood came too. I didn't know most of them, but a woman about my mom's age found me afterward and said, "Your father tried to help us. We didn't know until now. Thank you." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. They asked me to say something. I'd written a letter to my dad. I don't know if I can call it a speech. It was just me, talking to him, reading off a piece of paper because I knew if I tried to do it from memory I'd lose the words. I told him I found the truth. I told him I was sorry it took so long. I told him about his letter to Roland Calloway, the one where he asked for help exposing the contamination, the one they hid, and I said, "You were doing the right thing, Dad. You were always doing the right thing." My voice cracked on that line and I had to stop for a second. Jonah put his hand on my back. I kept going. I told him I finished what he started. After the ceremony, I went back to work, not to 714 Piedmont Road, to a small rented office on 9 Greendale Avenue, on the east side of Ashford, in the same neighborhood the chemical spill poisoned. I'd signed the lease 2 weeks earlier. The sign on the door says Whitfield Justice Collective. Jonah Pratt is my co-founder. We do pro bono work. We don't make any money yet. The office smells like fresh paint and coffee and the chairs don't match. It's the best place I've ever worked. Victor Mercer is facing a criminal trial. The Greendale community is getting a court-ordered environmental cleanup and a settlement fund. It's not enough. It's 20 years too late. But it's happening. My mom took my dad's law degree out of the closet where it's been sitting in a box since 1997. She hung it on the wall at 7 Birchwood Lane, right in the living room where you see it when you walk in. She called me to tell me she did it, and we both cried on the phone for 10 minutes, and then she said, "Okay, that's enough now." And I said, "Okay, Mom," and we hung up. That evening, I drove to Cedarwood Memorial Cemetery. The sun was going down. The sky was gold and purple, and it stretched out wide and quiet above the headstones. I knelt in front of my father's grave, and I placed a single white lily on the grass. I'd bought it from the shop on my way over. Nothing fancy. Just a flower. I said, "They know now, Dad. Everyone knows." I closed my eyes. I breathed. And for the first time I can remember, that thing I've carried in my chest since I was 11 years old, that tight, heavy, awful thing, it loosened. It didn't disappear. I don't think it ever fully will, but it loosened enough that I could breathe all the way in. I stood up. I walked back to my car. The sun was almost gone and my shadow stretched out long and thin behind me. I got in the car. I drove home.